The Dark History of Japanese-American Internment Camps, 1942 to 1945. During World War II, the U.S. government forcibly relocated and imprisoned around 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. This mass incarceration, justified as a wartime necessity, was fueled by racial prejudice, fear, and political pressure. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to remove individuals from certain areas without due process. This order specifically targeted Japanese Americans, forcing them to leave their homes, businesses, and communities. Causes and justifications for internment. While the government framed internment as a security measure after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, there was no evidence of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans. Instead, deep-seated racism and economic jealousy played a major role in their imprisonment. The internment camps, often located in desolate areas, were overcrowded and had harsh living conditions, forever altering the lives of those forced to live in them. Pearl Harbor Attack, December 7, 1941. The attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor heightened national security fears. The U.S. government worried about potential spies or saboteurs on the West Coast. The FBI and military conducted mass arrests of Japanese community leaders, but no acts of sabotage were ever proven. War hysteria and racism. Japanese immigrants had long faced discrimination in the U.S., especially on the West Coast. Laws prevented Japanese immigrants from becoming citizens or owning land. Many white Americans viewed Japanese Americans as perpetual foreigners, regardless of their U.S. citizenship. Military justifications. The U.S. military argued that Japanese Americans could not be trusted and that internment was necessary for national security. Despite these claims, the Hawaiian Japanese population, nearly 40% of Hawaii's people, was largely left alone because they were too essential to the local economy. Internment was not based on actual threats, but rather on unfounded fears and prejudice. Executive Order 9066. Signed on February 19, 1942, allowing military zones to be established and people to be forcibly removed. Japanese Americans were given little time to sell their homes and businesses, often at a fraction of their value. 2/3 of those interned were U.S. citizens, and many had never even been to Japan. The internment process. Entire families were ordered to leave their homes with only what they could carry. Many lost everything: homes, businesses, and personal belongings. White neighbors often took advantage of the situation, buying land and businesses at rock-bottom prices. Assembly centers. Temporary detention sites were set up in places like fairgrounds and racetracks. Families were crammed into horse stalls, cattle barns, and makeshift barracks. Basic needs were barely met. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and lack of privacy were common. Internment camps, war relocation centers. 10 major camps were built in remote deserts and swamps across the U.S., including Manzanar, California, one of the largest and most well-documented camps. Tule Lake, California, the most heavily guarded and used for those deemed disloyal. Heart Mountain, Wyoming, known for strong resistance to the military draft from within the camp. Barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed guards surrounded camps. Living conditions. Housing was poorly built, thin-walled wooden barracks with no insulation. Camp residents faced extreme heat in the summer and freezing temperatures in the winter. Food was basic and rationed, leading to malnutrition and health problems. Medical care was inadequate, and internees were often denied proper treatment. Psychological and social impact. Families were torn apart, with men often separated from their wives and children. Many Japanese Americans experienced lasting trauma, depression, and a deep sense of betrayal by their own country. Some young people joined the U.S. military to prove their loyalty, while others resisted the draft in protest. Resistance and legal challenges. Many internees protested their treatment through strikes, riots, and refusals to follow camp rules. The Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee organized draft resistance, arguing that Japanese Americans should not be forced to fight for a country that imprisoned them. Some Japanese Americans refused to report to the camps and were arrested. Legal cases. Korematsu versus United States, 1944. The Supreme Court upheld the internment policy, claiming it was a wartime necessity. Hirabayashi versus United States. 1943 challenged the curfews placed on Japanese Americans, but was upheld. Ex parte Endo, 1944 ruled that the government could not detain loyal citizens without cause, leading to the eventual closure of camps. Camp closures, 1944 to 1946. By 1944, the government slowly began releasing internees, but many had nowhere to go. Some had to live in temporary housing or were forced to start over completely. Discrimination continued, and some communities refused to allow Japanese Americans to return. Economic devastation. Many families lost everything and had to rebuild from scratch. Farmers lost land, business owners lost their customers, and workers struggled to find employment. Japanese Americans faced hostility from former neighbors who had taken over their properties. Government apology and reparations. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, officially apologizing for internment. Each surviving internee received $20,000 as compensation. The U.S. government acknowledged that internment was motivated by racism, not military necessity. Long-term effects. Many Japanese American families avoided speaking about their internment experiences due to shame and trauma. The internment camps became a rallying point for later civil rights movements. Today, organizations work to educate the public about this dark chapter in U.S. history. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II remains one of the most shameful violations of civil rights in American history. It serves as a reminder of how fear, racism, and political pressure can lead to mass injustice. Despite their wrongful imprisonment, Japanese Americans persevered, rebuilt their lives, and fought for recognition and justice. This chapter in history teaches us the importance of protecting civil liberties, especially in times of crisis. By remembering and acknowledging these injustices, we can work to ensure that history does not repeat itself. This history lesson was brought to you by Art and Whimsy.